So I'm Brad Taylor. I basically have two things I do professionally. For my own purposes, I have Awesome Advisors, which is a seed investment and consulting organization I have. And I use that also in other activities like not-for-profits. I'm a participant in Dallas AI. I was consulting for the last couple of years up until a couple of months ago, and now I'm helping lead strategy and transformation with ML at PepsiCo. So I've done some things that are fairly entrepreneurial and also started a data and AI company for a private equity organization. And so I've kind of banged my head against this wall a couple of different ways. And I have had Shawn to help me in the past. So Shawn, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Go figure. I actually used to work for Brad. Right now, I work at CDW. I am a data and AI evangelist, principal consultant for data and AI in our cloud practice and digital velocity. I do a bit of everything in the space. I mainly focus on clouds and NVIDIA. And I'm an avid photographer and diffuser. For those of you on the call who know what that is, my life is generating images. So if anybody ever wants to talk about that offline, more than happy. But that's what I do. I spend a lot of time talking about AI, strategizing, and building things.
And so what I'm going to do as an intro is I'm going to briefly talk about some of the intangibles where we've gone in a little over a decade to can we optimize our data storage so we're not spending too much money on storage, to cloud where we have unlimited storage, and now we realize the value of data. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as an intro to this, and then I'm going to hand it off to Shawn to talk about the really interesting stuff. But there's a lot of blocking and tackling that companies are now discovering, depending on the maturity, that they have to think about. And that's actually what I'm going to cover in this first part. So I'll go ahead and share my screen to get going. Okay, let me just make sure that the presenting mode is started so you guys can actually see the size, so that it won't be minute. Okay, and I do not have a lot of slides, and I will not talk to them, just enough to give you a little bit of context so you can see where we're going with this. So I think when you start hearing the questions that are asked of you as professionals, they're substantially different than they were a decade ago. There has been this concept that data is becoming more important, but I think nothing has emphasized that more than what's happened in the last 2 years, where we've seen a rapid acceleration of the maturity of algorithms, which turned out has made these large data sources and computational capabilities much more valuable. And it's been ironic because, I think that with some of the work that Shawn led in the past, we probably we were doing a lot with natural language processing, but didn't necessarily think about the amount of data that we would need. And so what I would say is William Gibson used to say the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I think what you'll see is a lot of these problems are problems where you've probably touched them in the past. And I'm going to give some specific examples of questions in addition to this slide, as well as some examples of the pitfalls, specifically commercially. And so you have different levels of maturity at different companies, and their experiences may vary quite a bit on the company's attitude toward risk-taking. But what I can tell you, generally speaking, is with some specific questions that I typically go through, and I'm going to try to put them in the chat here while I'm talking, that you may start to hear in your organization. And so, okay, great. Thank you for opening that up. So the first question is, and I'll try to cut and paste these as well. You may start to hear now, are we keeping and governing our data? Most companies I see now have pretty significant data governance programs going. But the corollary question, which is now getting asked to the data governance question, is, do we know our data rights and risk on commercial and consumer and third-party data? what you will hear the cool kids say now is they'll talk about zero and first and third party data. And so it's gotten to the point now we're really starting to talk about that in a very subtle context. And you may hear additionally that this idea around how are we managing our data from our partners? Do we have it at agreements where we have use rights, 100% use rights to the data? Do we have aggregation use rights? Do we have anonymization use rights, or does it require an opt-in? And so those questions, the business is starting to become aware of more, and as a result, they're starting to ask more complicated questions that move beyond technology. And the real drivers for these have been people are seeing now the value of data in a visible way with large language models, because I do meetings with other groups, including HR professionals. And I had an HR professional meeting about 5 months ago, and 2/3 of the audience had touched ChatGPT. So the knowledge has become much wider. So the corollary to that is already something that I'm sure many of you who have significant operations internationally aware of is, do we understand our responsibilities around data and AI stewardship? And do our partners and GDPR processors understand the same thing? And so when we start to think about that, originally GDPR was around your right to forget, and were you basically a data processor, or did you have a data processor that was maybe managing content for you? That's morphing a little bit, because now you're seeing, in conjunction with the changes, say in California and other states in the US, maturity also being part of GDPR, from the context of now they're starting to talk about AI as something that they're going to address. And that has already been pretty prevalent in some industries like finance. Algorithmic approaches in finance, if they were black boxes, were not permitted for many uses. So what we're seeing again is some catch up happening with the rest of the business segments outside of finance, where now they're seeing that if they have a global presence, they may have some additional compliance issue. And then the other thing, that if you're in cloud, and this was typically when everything was on-prem, it wasn't as big an issue. But one of the things Shawn introduced me to was Google Cloud Services DLP, which is their data protection product. And that essentially is there to not only handle data loss protection, which is what the L is for, but also to help mask out content that shouldn't be displayed because it's PII. And so this is the great thing about the changes that are having. We're starting to see the cloud providers step in and make things that were fairly complex, even on an on-prem basis, become a lot easier, because it's becoming generalized, at the cloud level. You're going to see that trend continue. There'll be not only the large cloud service providers, the really big ones, but there will be other services coming out around model training, especially with large language models. The idea that now you're dealing with vector databases and tokenization. And, so these are all things that you'll see new tools come about. And as you're being asked to do things in your role, you'll be seeing some of this come up as tools that you may find valuable, especially in the cloud area. And the final aspect of that is, as you get asked potentially to monetize your data, you're going to be asked to have a better understanding of what the envelope of both your potential usage and risk. To give you an example of this, I want to talk about two things that I've done in the last 6 years. And the first thing is, with a relatively large data source, terabytes of data, we went back and monetized the data, both from predictive analytics and from basically creating analytics products that then could turn around and be distributed to our partners, literally to the tunes of millions of dollars a year. And one of the things that we actually had to look at, and this happens in systems like SAP as well, because a lot of SAP modules, they have things like credit management. And so you have to think about, in a PII world and in the broader regulatory world, am I touching things where I'm committing people to credit changes, so I'm impacting their livelihood or ability to maintain viable business? In some of the things that the products we developed, we had to look at whether we were crossing into a line where we were impacting people's credit rating or insurance rating. And that gets you into new regulatory boundaries like the Federal Credit Reporting Act. And guess what? One of the things Jim and I had talked about was your attorneys in-house, unless you're in a very unusual business, will not be familiar with a lot of these topics. And in every organization I've been involved with, whether it was a startup where we were basically providing data management and connectivity for IoT devices, whether I was building a private equity company division to do AI, ML, and data analytics and data monetization, or in a large company like PepsiCo, where in the consumer, that has not been B2C has not been a big part of their business, but they are still finding out that they have PII issues that they have to start to consider as they go across different countries. And so you're going to have to start finding good attorneys. Maurice Foster, Jim and I were joking about that because their name is Mofo, is one firm that I've worked with, as well as some other ones. And you'll get into unusual areas, like if you're using data to create models, and it's your data, meaning it's not third-party data or a byproduct of your external customers. Is it worth copywriting the data? And if there are no ethical reasons not to copyright it, it's something you can consider. We did that discussion at a couple of different places I've been at. And these are all kind of new world areas that, along with the dynamic of large language models and diffusion and really just the advances being made with neural networks, even in predictive analytics, there are things that you have to think about. So what happens when you have issues that perhaps you didn't consider everything, touch all those steps in the process? Because this is obviously not something that we've had to deal with before at the scale that we do now. So the first one, and so Shawn and I actually are familiar with the person that is the former CIO, Chief Intelligence Officer at Stability.ai, a guy named Dan Jeffries, who's a well-known pundit in the AI ML space. He was also one of the main principals behind one of the AI infrastructure groups, not-for-profits. And so Stability.ai had a problem in that their images, when you start to have a diffused image, in addition to showing the really cool things that they would develop in the diffusion process out of your description, they would also occasionally show watermarks from proprietary images. And Getty was one of the ones that showed up quite commonly because Getty's a large provider of that content. Needless to say, there's a lawsuit about several $1 billion on this right now. And I think this is, until companies get better about this is going to be the rule rather than the exception, because it's quite easy to start do modeling without understanding the data rights. It's a bigger problem, obviously, with what we're seeing with the new scale with some of these neural network models. But something to keep in mind as you start to think about what you're doing with your data and with artificial intelligence. So the second thing I want to mention is the flip side of that. It's a new opportunity. And you see this predominantly with companies that already have a large amount of content. For a long time, we're basically monetizing themselves for their web interactivity. There's value in a lot of that data. That value has shifted around quite a bit. As I mentioned in the past, I was taking a relatively large volume of data, terabytes a month, and kind of running it through a series of processes and then turning around and selling either the analytics, an AI predictive model, or anonymized data to several customers. I don't think this trend is going to slow down. And it's something that you may or may not see in your business, but you may at some point be asked to look at this, because the trade-offs are, do I basically fall by the wayside with my data, or is there an opportunity to develop a new data model? And your data pipeline, your lineage, and how you're using it probably will be an influence in how successful you are if the market is actually there. And then probably the poster child for, oh, we've got a lot of really good data, and we got enough money to go actually pay for the computational costs to build a large language model, because most companies don't have that much money or the computational capabilities that you find in the cloud. Bloomberg went out and, using all their capabilities they've built over the years in content for finance, built a finance-specific, Bloomberg GPT transformer model, right? Generative transformer model. Why is this interesting, and why is this a big deal? So falling under the categories of the data ownership and how you treat it are going to create winners and losers. I was recently in discussions this year with a well-known survey company. They had done an acquisition in 2022 of, in the $100 million range. That training source for that financial product set that they bought was open source data. And it was basically the Consumer Protection Agency, if you're familiar with that agency, data. They're the watchguard on financial products. And so they have literally millions of complaints. And because they're a brand new government agency, they go out and clean all that data and anonymize it. And I've actually used it to train some chat, or actually not chat. I would say it's probably more like natural language processing, an NLP model for recognizing specific financial products from text. And that system that they paid a lot of money for is probably not worth there as much now. So there's definitely going to be winners and losers created in this process. And it's important to think about that from your data, because you're going to have competitors. And then a final note is, and I talked about the processes that are being put into places like Google Cloud, like in a DLP. But the great thing about what we're doing with general and generative AI is it works a lot better in the cloud. The computational capabilities, the ability to access a lot of different products. The one thing that it takes is a substantially larger amount of discipline for both data lineage and model lineage than most organizations currently have. And so this process is something you guys will probably see more and more demand for. DevOps is already started morphing to ML ops in the AI space, and I think this is only going to continue. Finally, this all seems like it's moving pretty quickly, and it is. I felt like 2 years ago I was ahead, and I feel like I'm behind again. And it's happening that quickly. And so, don't feel bad if you feel like you don't know what's going on, because I think even the people at OpenAI were surprised how quickly things moved. But AI will still have the same frailties that we already have as humans. And so that this overall process of touching all the bases with legal, thinking about what you've got to do internally from contract processes, from GDPR, how are you going to manage your data lineage? How are you going to manage your models, and how do you control them from both internal use and contract bases, and get them updated properly? Those are all things that are going to be influenced by humans and human behavior, and we'll still expect to see things happen that are not expected outcomes. But hopefully the disciplines that we've built over the years as professionals and the value that cloud can bring to it will make that less of an issue. And I'm hopeful that it won't be as big an issue as I think. But, the discipline of the organization and professionals like yourself will have a big impact on what the outcomes look like. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Shawn. I'm assuming my screen has stopped presenting.
Yep, your screen is stopped. Do you have time for one question? Maybe
sure, we can take questions however you want to do it.
Yeah, one came in from the Q&A chat. I'll read it out loud, so it'll be on the recording. So there's a question from John Shelburne. He's wondering about data ownership. Like, is there a way to watermark data? The data that the algorithm derives in order to maybe protect it somehow, or prove that, hey, this came from me. Have you worked in that area at all?
So I don't know of any way to watermark the data. What we've done, so this was with another private equity firm I was consulting with. And so this is a good example, putting aside the legal stuff, which you have to do too. I've spent a lot of money on lawyers at a couple of different companies on this. But the key thing you can do is you can assess your data and see if it's copyrightable, which doesn't really solve the watermarking problem, but it definitely cures the rights problem. Mm-hmm. And some of the questions that you'll have to ask first are ethical. So one of the copyright examples that I've worked with on as a consultant, right, that we went through this process, was at a image recognition company, meaning they were using, it was not medical, so it wasn't Aunt Louise's kidneys or anything. And so there was no ethical question about the data. The data was basically used to identify contaminated products. So food products or some other consumer product. And so they had, a decade of essentially X-ray imaging that they had. And they had never built any kind of model, and quite frankly, didn't have the capabilities in-house to do it. So the two strategies we looked at were copywriting the data, which they could do. And that would eliminate any uncertainty about if the images got out and got used in a model. There are some exceptions developing. Japan is talking about not allowing copyrighted data to constrain model building. So that's still evolving. And of course, there's a lot of diktats coming out from different bureaucracies in the world right now. But what we did is we did look seriously at that. We decided it was too cost prohibitive because we didn't have an ROI that we knew we were going to get. What we did instead was we went through a process of sort of doing something informal watermarking, meaning we basically did go back and put things onto the image more from the naming perspective. Mm-hmm. And then what we did is when we wrote the contract with the firm that ended up doing the work, we were very explicit that the content could not be used to train any other models, that the contractor was taking on liability if it got out, and that they did leave it open to some point down the line that if the contractor wanted to use it in equipment they built, that there could potentially be a shared revenue model. But they would not allow the sale of that to a competitor without prior approvals.
Okay. So
everything else we've done pretty much has been by opt-in, but trying to track access points, and then formally, and this tells you how primitive it's been at times. In 2016, we actually built something in Salesforce to just go in, and every time we went through a contract, we determined whether our use rights were unlimited, whether we could, do it with anonymized, and aggregated or aggregated. And that's still playing out today. If you go buy data from certain providers, they will include provisions that you cannot use that data to improve operations of their competitors.
Oh, cool. Well, thanks, Brad. There is one kind of long question in the Q&A chat from Paulo. While Shawn is presenting, if you want to take a look at it and maybe reply back in the chat, that'd be great. Shawn?
If I can find it.
Are you ready?
Let's do it. I am absolutely ready. There's the share screen button. Allow to share screen. We'll go large screen. Can everybody see stuff?
Give it a second. I can't see anything yet.
No, I promise. Before this call, we had tested everything.
We practiced it. We did practice it.
We practiced.
I can still see an active share screen button on my side, so maybe it's the system's not recognizing it. So maybe let me share my screen, so I'll steal it, and then maybe that'll unlock it.
Yeah. Try.
Let's give it a shot. Share screen. All right, and then I'll stop sharing. And then it should be active for you.
And let me refresh mine just to make sure it's released.
Oh, we're good.
All right, I see something. I see my own face.
Now do you see something else?
Yes, yeah. How far? Yeah. Yeah.
As I make it even worse for myself, has anybody seen the Keystone Cops recently? This is reminiscent of that. Now, are we good?
Yep, it's looking good. Thanks, Shawn. Yeah, we got it.
Hi, I'm Shawn. I professionally work in technology and speaking. Look at how well I just did that. Also, nice of everybody to join us today. I actually did work for Brad, and that's where I started really cutting my teeth on how important data is, because you don't have an idea of how it plays out until you see thousands and thousands and thousands of diverse people interacting. And then all of a sudden, once you aggregate that up, you're like, oh, this is why no one likes IVRs. This makes sense. And you can just quickly see patterns, right? And that's still true today. Here's the kicker to everything you're about to see. I used AI to generate it. It's my writing. I built my own personal assistant. It's built off my data sets. And for images, it's all Stable Diffusion or Adobe Firefly. So proof in the pudding, I put together PowerPoints in minutes instead of hours, and I let a lot of the machinery do the machinations for me. A lot of people are very concerned about AI. Always, for some reason, right? Here's a couple little blurbs. The big takeaway here is the human brain outpowers any hardware we are even close to developing by a country mile. So scare tactics in AI aren't something you will ever hear me talk about. I don't believe it is good for the practice at all. There are cautionary tales, absolutely things we need to talk about. But as it pertains to scare tactics, this is the only cue I'm worried about. I'm sure some people are in the room old enough to understand who this is and get the reference. Everybody was blowing up about Sam Altman leaving OpenAI, coming back. The whole kerfuffle. Was he building a new tensor processor with the Saudis? Was it Q, this great new mathematical genius that can add 2 plus 2? As though we never knew what a mainframe was. I try and move out of those talking points quite a bit because there's enough of them out there. There's all this negativity around data, AI, job replacement. And I just don't, that's not what I'm out here developing in Google, in a number of platforms, right? I do 100% believe that we can develop generative solutions together that lift everybody up, right? I'm sure most people have heard the phrase rising tide lifts all ships. I 100% believe that. For all the hype around generative AI, which is my specialty, it's outstanding middleware. I said it out loud. It is outstanding middleware. It is the best middleware that we have come up with to date. But that's what it is. It's middleware, and it's designed to allow people to interact with esoteric data sets that might not normally be within their purview or skill set or their learned capabilities, right? That's the real power behind all this stuff is equitability. It's an equitable approach. So when I develop solutions for companies out in the wild, this is one of the very, very first pillars I talk about. And two, I talk about their data governance strategy and their data preparedness. I would be misleading everybody here if I didn't tell you, out of all the companies I talk to, and we are legitimately talking about 200 people companies all the way up to Fortune 10 companies, there are a lot of them that don't have their data governance, data prep, data ops, data mesh. Those are all different things. Concepts prepared and ready to go to do any of this stuff. It is simply amazing. Because what I learned very early on in telecommunications, working in conversational AI, is data is king. And that's where you can make the inferences. But what makes it really sing is the diversity of opinions you can get when a number of diverse people, diversity of thought, have access to those data, right? So that's a whole big chunk of it. The other big chunk of it is human-centric design. Where I work and what I do is we design human-centric approaches. Everybody has a generative AI use case. Everybody has an ML use case. Great. Outstanding. How they benefit your workforce. Because in these economic times, guess what? Whoa, hey, look, share screen, and my boss has hit me up. Lovely. So in these trying economic times, everybody is very invested in their skill set, and they're very worried about job contraction, right? So you don't want to scare them off with AI or, hey, my company's getting ready to embark on this AI journey. We're all doing duet AI. People start getting nervous. So when we work with empathy in those solutions, game changer, absolute game changer. This is the holistic philosophy, right? And I'm sure a number of you heard human-centric versus work-centric. Well, I've taken the human-centric portion and made it human-centric delivery. There's all kinds of reasons this is important. Security being one. If you have happy employees that have capabilities given to them via generative AI, guess what? They're going to be more secure. They're not going to use shadow AI options out in the world. I'm looking at you.com and OpenAI non-enterprise. And right, you don't want to freak people out. So you take in their input. Everybody builds things together. It is a very powerful way to get security adopted, uptake of AI adopted within a company, and everybody is invested now in the company because guess what? They get to use the cutting edge tools that help them be part of the workforce in the 21st century, right? We're not in the 1900s anymore. People are more productive when you put them first. I mean, it's just the reality of the situation. Why am I belaboring this point? See this office support line? Like you can see me pointing on my screen. This office support line at the top. Hey, that's Gen Z. That's our kids. They're getting ready to just get hammered out in the world. So once they get there, one of the things that I can do as a technocrat is position generative AI tools in these businesses. And I work in higher ed a lot and K through 12 and doing it at the educational level. So a whole diverse group of people get exposed to these tools when they enter the workforce. They'll be more capable. They'll be more capable in and of themselves. 100% believe all of that. And this is another chart from Forrester that shows the movement around industries over the coming years. But here's the juice as I check time real quick. Diversity of insight is one of the most powerful tools that we have developing data and in turn AI, right? If you take a stratification of a company and pull from it, you can identify bias that I might not have been able to see, right? Others will be able to pull in those things. It pertains to a diversity of leadership, right? It's all about that lateral movement of thought that really drives solutions, and it drives uptake of solutions, right? And I have a whole slew of pretty pictures around diversity of insight, right? But one of the big things that you heard me lead with was that equity of information. These are talks I have with companies that are very conservative and very cost minded. They use the term reduction in workforce a lot, right? They want to increase people's throughput. My job is to help them find that solution. But part of my job is also making sure that everybody understands what that solution entails. deploying things. You have clean data sets, quality data sets. You layer on that generative AI. Guess what? Now you have made your workforce completely extensible and increased all of their throughput. You might not have to hire more people. You can move individuals around the org where needed now, and or if you do have to cut them loose, at least they have a new skill set to go into the world with, right? And then they can be more valuable. There's not a lot of Shawns out there. There's not a lot of Brads out there. Give it a few years and there'll be more. And I'm yearning to see it because of this, because we can all be a Shawn or a Brad now, thanks to generative AI. Again, for me, that's not hyperbole. That's reality. And that's what I work for. Look at these use cases for generative AI. That's another thing I get asked about. Hey, we need to do a workshop on use case discovery. Cool, there's like 20 use cases for generative AI across the board. We could paint them different colors, but there's a bucket of them. And we change the words, but there's really, really, really a fixed amount, and they mainly go internal towards the workforce. And this is a selection of them. And you can take these 5 and rework them a number of different ways. But data visualization, personalizing your content, speaking the language that you speak, right? And I don't mean from English to Spanish. I mean from like north of the Mason-Dixon line to south of the Mason-Dixon line English, right? Those are different. Why wouldn't I want to interact with things that best represent me? Of course. Why not? Simplification and explanation, right? I use generative AI to take big ideas and nail them all the way down. It helps me simplify my own thought process. Who hasn't seen this in some slide deck or slideware somewhere? Ethics. I talk about it all the time. But that first one is the most important one. Empowerment and supervision of humans. This is not romp appeal for those who will get that reference. It's not set it and forget it. It is oversight. It is a continuous improvement and continuous delivery pipeline where you manage the data and you look at the data through a whole variety of lenses. And why do I say data versus AI? Guess what? We all know AI is founded on data. It all ends with data. It all begins with data. 100%. I might actually trademark this phrase. I love it. The data renaissance. Data renaissance. We know what those terms mean. Put them in the blender. A period of significant change and renewed interest in the field of data. Absolutely hitting right now. Anytime I talk about language models with client, if they don't have data governance or they're unaware of how important it is, and we have that discussion, the other flip side of it is they're now amazingly aware of how important it is and how to pull things through. That is dead. Long live data, right? Not a couple years ago, we weren't even talking about it that much. At least in my world, it was all conversational AI. It was IoT, not really data. Generative AI gives us a whole different amount of interaction data. How important is that to intellectual property? Companies don't think about that at all. If I'm working, we'll say at a large magazine, and I'm prompt engineering to generate images, who owns that IP? Is it IP? Those are very serious questions. Those are questions that I have had as a consultant with legal departments in that space, right? My name's Shawn Augenstein. I'm not a lawyer. But it's a very concern. And then you start getting the creatives in. I'm a big fan of Adobe Firefly because they stand by the data sets underneath, and it's very easy to work with, right? But, there's a big but, how do you close the loop on the prompts your creatives are using to generate that content that is yours via copyrighted, because Adobe, read the T's and C's. How do you capture that information? Do you own those prompts? There's a whole life cycle around prompt engineering, the IP of the prompts therein, and who owns that no one is really discussing. at all. And everybody on this call, as it pertains to generative AI, should immediately click, click, click. CI/CD pipelines for prompt engineering. You're welcome. They're super important, right? Prompts and interactions. That's statistically relevant. Who's doing what? How often are they doing it? How do they interact with a thing? But take that inside to the workforce. Then you can see, hey, I can automate these processes. These are the things a large amount of the workforce is doing repetitively, right? So that's why I'm like, point generative AI back into your workforce. It has a lot of chutzpah there, right? Here it is. Prompts and interactions hold immense value. Should be treated as a form of intellectual property. It's kind of where I stand, right? I know I work in Adobe Photoshop. You can see the cameras behind me. I am a professional photographer. People have paid me for pictures. Guess what? If I'm using specific prompts that are in my head in this way, who owns that? If I generate enough pictures. Whew. Now we're talking about owning language. The new IP. It's pretty heavy, right? Something we have to understand. Got to find the legal precedent. This image right here, Adobe Firefly, it's my image. Anybody on this call could take it, drop it in diffuser X, Y, or Z, and start reworking it. This isn't watermarked. You could absolutely do it. Couldn't stop you. I can watermark images, back to the question from earlier. Images, audio, absolutely watermark and trackable. Straight up data, ones and zeros, especially if it's DLP pulled out, not anything I'm aware of yet, right? So I go around a lot. New IP, unclear legal frameworks, ownership and authorship, patent and copyright. Trade secrets is a way companies can protect themselves. Hey, if prompts or interaction data valuable to the business, that's our trade secrets. Patents and copyrights. Maybe you build your own model. Probably a couple of years. Not going to be too far afield to build your own model in your backyard, right? If you put your own material in there and then put that LLM out in the wild, who owns what, right? Well, but trade secrets can give you some air cover. Maybe you patent and copyright your model and get it out the door. And you heard Brad talk about contracts and licensors. So there is a number of heady things in this world, especially as it pertains to the new IP. So I go over a lot. I'm going to make this a bit smaller. And I like personally interacting with an audience quite a bit. It is my strong suit. So I'm not sure how I am on time, but I would like questions. I would like a lot of questions because everybody has to have them. I'm not a lawyer, but I would say the risk here.
That one, Brad's answering a really long question with a nice answer. So that one's the Q&A chat. But the regular chat's there. The Q&A chat is there. There was one question when you're giving your presentation, Shawn, not a technology one, but are you a Toastmaster?
I am not, but that is very kind of you to think so.
It's the question from Eugen. He's with our Southlake Toastmaster Club. They're are they the Dragon Masters? I forget Eugen, but yeah.
That's a great name.
And why I have a couple minutes still, I think it's important for everybody on the call again to understand in the world of generative AI, it's still so just new, period, point blank. And we're all still feeling out where the corners are. But if you rest your head on quality data intake, quality data governance, and then involving the right stratification of people up front, it changes things. And that is a dynamic I encourage companies to take going forward because the dynamics of us as citizens is changing, right? And how we look at work is changing. So now's a great time to involve everybody and protect the data by that involvement.
I don't know how to decode what Joshua Corbett typed in, but maybe it was the cat on the keyboard.
Oh man, ASCII art's a hard copy and paste.
Yeah, it might have been ASCII art. All right. Scrolling through the Q&A chat, some more answers from
Cleaning keyboard.
cleaning the keyboard. So I have I know I come from a software development background, and the one thing that I haven't been able to get in my head yet, and maybe you guys have some insight, maybe not. But one of the popular things to do in software development is to do test-driven development. So you write your tests, then you write your code, make sure the tests pass. And with your large language models, they seem to me like they're not deterministic what they're going to send back. I'm not, do unit tests go out the door if now I have an application that's that's using a large language model on the back end? Have you had a chance to think of that or run into ways that people have dealt with something like that?
Well,
We develop whole regression test suites for language models. Period. One of the things. Hey, here's a funny thing, Brad. Remember that how the test speech engines architecture we
right,
built?
yes.
Hey, it's take two with language models. So we have a fixed bank of interactions, depending, right? So I'll stick with conversational, large Kong, Llama, GPT-4, right? That's our test. But then we have interactions that go through, and we validate the drift on the interactions over time, validate the repetition of the interactions within a certain time frame, and of course the outputs of the model, and then just minute changes in language when you go into them will totally change an output. But part of that is really done because of the prompt engineering work we do, because I have prompts that are 1,600 characters that operate like software systems. So you have to be able to test those prompts through interactions.
And what I would say is we're seeing novel ways of trying to cover some of these, in addition to the tense and those kind of test suites. We're also seeing novel ways of using sort of the human power. I mean, basically, OpenAI used everybody else to determine whether what they were doing with ChatGPT was actually giving good answers. So sort of that crowdsourcing the feedback, and that's a time-honored way to clean images and other things as well. I mean, that's been used for a long time. There are people now, when you start looking at things like LangChain and some of the other things that are out there now, I think there is an idea that at some point you could build out a system where you're able to use other model capabilities to somewhat determine whether the answers make sense. But nobody has succeeded in doing this at the scale that it would completely handle something like ChatGPT.
And it's the human effort that really is the kicker as much as anything, whether you crowdsource it via internal usage, right, which is the number one, and then capture that. That's the best way to see it outside of doing it programmatically. You got your Mechanical Turks, so on and so forth, that can just execute those tests for you.
And SMU, ironically, in the gaming guild, Dr. Clark, who's there, also has his own company. And what they do is they combine game frameworks with some Bayesian capabilities. So where they're getting, they can crowdsource a lot of people and get a secondary lift and then tune it to types of models. I don't think they've applied it. They've applied it to neural networks. I don't think they've tried it with large language models yet. But I think that's where you're going to see success, is a combination of those two things to try to increase the utility of the identification and training process for testing.
Cool. Reading in the Q&A chat, there's one from Daniel Lemire. This is like building on the intellectual property discussion. He considers prompt engineering to be natural language programming, so it seems logical there's CI/CD discipline involved. But how do you view the prompt management in terms of generating already trademarked or proprietary properties? As we saw a few weeks ago, the DALL-E banning Superman, but a prompt that explained you wanted a caped man that can fly and shoot lasers from his eyes would result in the same thing.
How close is it to Superman? Will it pass the smell test? It's a great question. And it actually is a great question. Not just a, hey, that's a great question. So Adobe does the same thing. You can't drop in certain key phrases. Certain words in DALL-E 2 and Azure, Luddite tripped me up. It was like, this word's a pejorative no matter which way you slice it. We're not going to do it. So there's always going to be the edge. And there's going to be nefarious actors, I may or may not be one of them, who are always going to see where that edge is at. So back to your core question of CI/CD. When I work with creatives in companies, we usually have a set of boundaries of what we're going to do with prompts, meaning how we're going to work with them around language and what models we're working against. Those boundaries are what sets the standards, right? It has to be here before it's anywhere else, especially for creatives, because we have enough lateral thinking to give me a guy in a blue bodysuit with a right? Absolutely. That's what we do. So companies, it's always going to be a game of cat and mouse. For a CI/CD process, absolutely, but this is where there's very few tools out there right now that you can dev against to build those. That's a really good non-answer.
Yeah, I can take that a little
game
bit
of
further.
Cat and mouse.
Yeah. I'll take it from just the CI/CD discipline perspective, and I think that's a very insightful question, Daniel. This is actually how Jim and I met. I talked a lot about this at DevOps days, and the simple answer is most of the practitioners who are now getting into the space have not thought about the problem of, with neural networks and large language models in particular, there is no going back. You can only go forward. So your success is largely going to be built on you taking checkpoints along the way and managing your data lineage and your model lineage with a great discipline, great deal of discipline. We're only now getting good at that. Products like Databricks now have some more capabilities around MLOps in it. Kubeflow does the same thing. And it's going to be an entirely bigger problem with large language models because now you're talking about also having to manage the tokenization and the vectors. And I don't know that anybody's doing it well yet. Probably in OpenAI or some of the other places that have been thinking about it for a long time, they're probably more advanced. But you can't go out and turnkey a data lineage, tokenization and vector management system. They just don't exist right now.
And then there's an even heavier way, right? You go through that entire extent. Let's say we get there. You still may have to go through some sort of methodology to reweight things on the fly as an image is generated. So if I go guy in blue latex suit, red cape, because those things have been strung together so often, still yet another piece of middleware, reweight them so it forces the image to behave a different way. But that's spitballing talk. We're kids playing with fire for the first time on a number of fronts. It's awesome. We just built the plane.
Okay. Next question from Nilsa Rincon. Maybe this one's looking for some tools or solutions. Do you have any tools or solutions that you could name that help anonymize documents?
Well, I mentioned from the pulling identified things that can be identified easily from a pattern perspective. DLP, DLP does it. Typically, what I've done in the past, it's been you try to do it algorithmically with an existing list or something, stop words or something like that. But there's no, the lists have gotten bigger and better, but I don't know of anything that I would say is just, oh yeah, go do this. And I think that that's another area of maturity that you're going to have to see happen, especially with these large language models, because as we've just talked about, trademarks and content that can be considered trade secrets, and a reason a lot of big companies are hesitant to get on the Chat GPT bandwagon, even in the paid version, is because of what has happened to places like Samsung, where they had people coming in and start putting in content without realizing, what the legal and outcome constructs, using it for zero-shot training, and have ended up disseminating some of the proprietary information. So there's always been things built into NLP, frameworks to do some of this, but you're pretty much drawing on things that aren't designed to work at the kind of scale that we're doing now.
Okay. Question from Paulo Martin on like image detection. Is there on images have you seen any tools or open source technology that recognize AI images to see if they're misinformation or provocative images? Any? Maybe just start with just
Adobe has tool sets to specifically recognize Photoshop images or AI generated images. So they have a whole specific slew of tools just around that. When you say provocative or misinformation or things of that nature, because there's not a tight definition around them, right? I mean, we all as planet Earth do not agree on a definition of these things, right? There aren't great tool sets to do those unilaterally that I am aware of. Meaning, hey, these are the types of images specifically I'm looking to remove, tags, so on and so forth. As it pertains to copyrighted information, images, audio, Adobe has tools. You're actually the best tool to detect images, not copyright, but when it pertains to AI writing, AI images. Like, we're extremely good at it. And if anybody, hey, follow my LinkedIn, just dropped an article about that earlier today. All right, where Sports Illustrated was caught using fake avatars, and then they generated the avatars who generated the story, then they generated the bio, and shoom. But people caught it because it didn't line up. They came out of thin air.
They're like, this guy from Philly's not going to have that opinion. No, I don't know. I don't know how they figured it out. Okay, Jaime Espinosa has a question on explainability. Is explainability a must-have, or will people get comfortable now knowing that the algorithm works?
Wow. So, there's pretty interesting to watch how people behave with AIs, right? And Shawn Augenstein has pointed out some. He and I both like evil AI cartoons. So there's some great things in about people will trust machines over people because whatever they perceive expertise. I think that it's going to vary a lot by people, individual, and then I think the other thing will be what's the risk associated with that trust factor. The early, as Jim, I like to say, we don't have to worry about whether AI is going to kill anybody because it's done it already because of autonomous vehicles. And,
right.
That has sort of been the cutting edge of what we think AI is going to be in a lot of ways. And, there are people that are pretty concerned about it. There are also people that don't seem to have any concern about writing, in a autonomously controlled vehicle. So I think the risk is always going to be around perception.
Yeah, I have like zero concern about that. And it's hilarious you bring up the evil AI cartoons because I just saw one about that specifically. which is maybe for the, hey, make the call. Who do you hit? Do you hit the telephone pole or the pedestrian? I'm like, hey, maybe we just don't ask that question, because that's like, why are we scaring people?
Well,
It's good because it's going to happen no matter what. How do we make it randomized?
Well, yeah, but the interesting thing is, and this is why I'm being kind of dancing around the answer to this question. So the recent Evil AI cartoons was kind of a spin-off of studies done at MIT and other places around autonomous vehicle. A lot of the early cartoons were really around autonomous vehicles. And what they found is they built ethical processes to make this determination, where they go out and essentially survey. And it's what they used to call the trolley car problem, which is trolley cars out of control. Somebody's gonna die. Is it in the people? And then what you have is people of different ages, and are they complying with the law? Like, is one jaywalking, whereas one's on the sidewalk? Is one a doctor and the other a nun? Male, female, small child. And what they found is the decision-making process for a lot of these things was cultural, meaning how you thought about it in the United States was not the same way you thought about it in another part of the world. And so, the whole idea is, what everybody came to is kind of what Shawn said. We don't want the manufacturers incentivized to killing everybody else except for the driver.
And those are the corner cases that we hyper focus on, but they're corner cases. But I'm really, how do we like pseudo randomize that just to take it out of the equation? But what you just talked about, again, we've talked about model drift forever, but we don't talk about cultural drift against a model. If I'm testing a LLM and it has a certain efficacy in a certain part of the US, there is no guarantee that it's going to have that same efficacy in a different part of the US, because culture, right? And that's something we don't take into account when we design interactions in a number of places, right? So though I joke, I'm like, hey, how can we just randomize it like purely as best as possible? Oh, might have to, because we can't right now account for cultural differences programmatically across the board.
I'm going to ask Shrudi's question, and then I'm going to reserve one final one. It won't be a technical one, but I'll reserve one question that I ask everybody. So Shruti asks about the chip shortage. Do you think so many companies building LLMs for themselves will be able to get enough GPUs? And do you see GPU prices skyrocketing because of such a big demand?
100%. Right. But where I started off talking earlier. Oh, wait, MPUs are coming up as soon as we have good LLMs working on mobile devices. We might as well bring MPUs into the conversation. We're going to hit it on all three corners: CPU, GPU, TPU, and MPU now. It's going to be tight for a long time. Even I, who shill for NVIDIA, have to wait to get Teslas. I have to wait to get Tesla's reservations in my cloud providers, right? The chips. So it's going to be tight for a hot second, but it will push development into how to leverage CPUs to do parallel work, how to use a diverse processor set. My personal favorite, let's just go get loads of PlayStation 4s, build cluster computer and see how that goes, right? Those things got GPUs for days. You can get them on eBay by the truckload.
And I think the other thing that's happening on the data science that we've seen is we're getting better at tuning the algorithms. Not many companies can afford to do the computational work done by OpenAI and Google and some of the other players at scale. Even AWS to a certain extent isn't trying to compete on that. They're trying to compete by providing other platforms, a choice of platforms to use. But what you are seeing is people saying, well, now we understand how the algorithms work better. We can get similar, not identical, but similar accuracy with smaller data sets. And that was really where BERT started anyway. So I think that is the other piece. You're still going to see limitations on people really doing the huge ones. So the race to, GPT-7 equivalence is going to be limited to just a certain number of people. But I think what you're going to see is people who are going to be willing. I built models with relatively low accuracy that had a high enough ROI, and I'm not talking about natural language processing here. I'm talking about predictive analytics. That I wasn't getting 99% accuracy. I was getting somewhere in the high 80s, but the ROI was good enough that the customer still wanted it. And I think people will find that they can get good enough accuracy for certain applications that you'll see NLP, the NLP use with language models continue generative side broaden significantly, even if they don't have, even if they're not using LLM, they're doing their own, or they're limited to one-shot training.
All right. The final question, it's career advice. So we might have some really new people to the tech industry on, and we do sometimes get college students joining in from their Google clubs or otherwise. So if you could maybe go back in time, talk to your 20-year-old Brad or 20-year-old Shawn. And it doesn't have to be technology career advice necessarily, but if you're thinking of career advice to give a younger person or a younger you, any words of wisdom or direction to maybe get them on a path, or what do you think, Brad?
I'm going to let beauty. I'm going to let beauty before age go. Shawn, I'm going to let you go first, and since I'm older, then I will.
Oh man, what a heady question. I am actually extremely happy and thankful for this path and choices I've made. I don't know that younger me would have listened well, but what I can say, what helped more than anything else, and this is the cheesiest thing you are going to hear all day. I absolutely believed in myself and my ability to learn. And I didn't let anybody dissuade me. I came from a poor home in West Virginia, right? Strike number one. So there were plenty of places where I could have just been like, this is my lot in life. Boom, boom, boom. But I didn't. I just believed in myself and kept learning independently, but kept learning against what I like to do. And I've been fortunate to have people like Brad in my career that lifted me up because, and he's seen it firsthand, there are people that will beat you down for you. And you just got to persevere through it and be true to yourself. But more importantly, always believe in yourself. And I know it's corny, but 100% believe it, because that's what got me here.
I don't know if it's too corny. I actually like it.
Yeah. So I'll take it a little bit different direction because I think Shawn did a great job articulating sort of the internal values you have to be successful. What I would say is that you have to be very flexible about your career thinking. I've now been through multiple technology evolutions. And the one thing I've always done is I've tried to make sure, kind of like, talking to the group here, I'm sure there are people here who are probably smarter than I am. And I think I have never hesitated to learn from other people. It's proven to be incredibly beneficial over the years. I learned a lot from working with Shawn. And, he basically was a spur for a lot of my thinking. And, I've been very fortunate that I've put myself in situations and was willing to listen to people. You have to have that flexibility because, the tools are going to change. But for example, I think large language models and the changes with neural networks in general are going to be a great, leveler in the sense that if you become a good tool user, it's going to really help you with whatever your other strengths are. And so I think that's the big thing I keep coming to, and it's harder every year, honestly. I thought I knew a lot about NLP, and then OpenAI really kind of turned up the volume in the last 2 years. That's going to be the thing. You're going to have to kind of continue to self-educate, pay attention to what's happening. And I would never hesitate to understand what the business is doing and try to figure out what you learned, how that'll apply to the business. Because the language of business is, their love language in the business world is not about, the things that maybe we care about on a daily basis when you're building any kind of predictive analytics or large language model. They want to hear how it's going to apply to their job and help them do their job better and ideally make them more successful. And I think that's always the thing you have to keep in mind as you learn these exciting new things. You can help other people who do not understand these things apply them.
Nice. Well, Brad, Shawn, great advice at the end. Thank you for spending time with us, coming and sharing your, a few steps ahead of a lot of people and being able to see that, okay, it's brand new technology, but there's, some things we still need to worry about, like data governance, intellectual property. The human is still involved, even though, things might look a little bit, a little bit frantic from some points of view, but there's still the human involved. But really, thanks for spending the time with us. I'll give you a little round of applause.
Thank you. I'm answering one more question.
All right, while you're answering the question, Brad, just instructions on the next phase. So we do have a little bit, a second part of the session. So the question and answer and the presentation is done. We'll post the video on YouTube in a few days, attach it to the event page. I'll get the slides from Brad and Shawn so that they can be on the event page too as well, if it's possible. We'll take a 5-minute break, and the second half is optional. It's just a little bit of networking. Sometimes speakers stick around, sometimes not. Sometimes people need to run to a kids event or get some dinner. So if you guys can't stick around, no problem. If you can stick around, it'd be great to have you. I'll throw up a 5-minute timer on the screen, and when we come back, I'll make everybody a presenter, and we can have a little discussion and get to know each other. And if you are in Dallas, we do have a happy hour on December 7th, 4 to 6. The details are on the GDG page. So thank you everybody for joining.
Yeah, and I want to say great that the Tarrant County Southlake GDG group is bigger than the Dallas one, because being a Tarrant County guy living in Fort Worth, it's just great to see it.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Brad.